Settle in. Close your eyes. Let us go back to Australia, to the autumn of 1966. Picture the world as it was then. It is a strange year to be alive, though almost nobody living through it thinks of it that way. 1966 feels ordinary to the people inside it, the way every year does from the inside. But look at it from a distance and it hums. The Cold War is at its most anxious middle age. The Americans are deepening their commitment in Vietnam, and Australian conscripts are being sent there too, and every family with a boy of a certain age has a particular knot in the stomach when the mail arrives. Nuclear testing is still going on in the Pacific, out beyond the horizon, in atolls with soft musical names, and the fallout drifts on winds that do not consult maps. Satellites are new enough that people still go outside at dusk to watch them cross the sky. Small moving stars that nobody had ever seen before 1957. The sky, in other words, has recently become a place where things happen. For all of human history, the sky held weather and birds and lightning and the slow wheel of the stars. Now it holds machines. Now it holds nations. Now it holds the possibility that something enormous and invisible is passing over your house at very great height, and that it belongs to someone, and that it is watching. Into that sky, on that autumn morning, something falls. Australia in 1966 is a country in the middle of becoming something else. The suburbs are spreading outward from Melbourne like water across a table. Clayton South is one of those new edges. It is not the city, and it is not the country. It is the seam between them. Streets have been laid out, and houses have gone up in neat rows with sensible fences, and hills hoists turning slowly in the backyards, and beyond the last row of houses the paddocks simply begin. Long grass, scrub, tea trees and low bracken. A patch of open land known locally as the Grange, which is really just a name that people gave to a place that had never needed one before, because it was only ever the space between things. The children of Clayton South play in that space. They cut through it walking home. They know where the ground dips and where the ants nest and where the grass grows tall enough to disappear into. They know it the way you knew whatever field or lot or stretch of wood sat behind your own childhood, which is to say completely, and without ever once needing a map. Westall High School sits at the edge of that world. A low brick building, functional, unlovely of its era. Long corridors, windows that stick, classrooms that smell of chalk dust and floor polish, and the peculiar warm plastic smell of an overhead projector. Outside there is a sports oval with grass worn thin down the middle, and a fence, and past the fence, the paddocks. Autumn in Melbourne is a gentle season. The heat of summer has broken. The light comes in at a lower angle and turns everything the colour of weak honey in the late afternoon. In the mornings there is a coolness that has not yet decided to become cold. The sky, on a good day, is a wide, clean blue with nothing in it at all. On the morning of April 6th, 1966, the sky over Clayton South is exactly that kind of blue. Let me introduce you to a girl. Her name is Tanya Brearley. She is 16 years old. She's entirely fictional, invented for this story, but I want you to see her clearly anyway, because the story only works if you can. She's tall for her age and slightly embarrassed about it, so she stands with a small, apologetic curve in her spine that her mother is forever telling her to correct. Her hair is dark and heavy and refuses to hold any style for longer than an hour. She has ink on the side of her right hand permanently, the way left-handed and heavy-handed writers do. She's not a remarkable student. She's not a troublemaker either. She sits in the middle rows, does her homework mostly on time, and has the particular quality that certain teenagers have of noticing things and saying nothing about them. She notices when adults are lying. She notices when a room has changed mood. She notices the difference between someone who does not know an answer and someone who knows an answer and is choosing not to give it. This is not a talent she is aware of having. She simply assumes everyone sees these things. That quality is why this story belongs to her, her father, Arthur. Briley works for the railways, in an office rather than on the track, which he considers a small personal defeat. He is a careful, quiet, decent man who reads the newspaper front to back every evening and has strong opinions about the correct way to fold it. He served in the war in a capacity he does not discuss, and the not discussing is so complete that Tanya has never even worked out which theatre he was in. There is a photograph on the mantelpiece of a much younger Arthur squinting into the sun in a uniform, and when Tanya was small she asked about it, and he said, "That was a long way from here, love," and that was the end of it. Her mother, Eileen, teaches piano to neighbourhood children in the front room 3 afternoons a week, so the house is often full of the same 8 bars played badly at slightly different speeds. Tanya has come to find this comforting. She can still hear it, decades later, when she thinks of home. It is a Wednesday. That detail matters only because Wednesdays are unremarkable, and the entire strangeness of what is about to happen sits inside the fact that it happens on a completely unremarkable Wednesday. Tanya has physical education in the morning. The girls are out on the oval doing something with hoops and a whistle that none of them takes especially seriously. There is a small breeze. The grass is still damp in the shadowed strip along the fence line. Somewhere inside the building a class is reciting something in unison, the sound of it drifting out through an open window and dissolving before it reaches the far side of the field. And then, at some point mid-morning, a girl at the far end of the oval stops running and looks up. It is worth pausing here, before the object appears, to notice how ordinary the moment is. Nobody's waiting for anything. Nobody has been primed. There is no rumour circulating that morning, no radio broadcast, no lecture the previous week about flying saucers. There is simply a school, and a field, and a whistle, and a Wednesday. And that ordinariness is the single most important feature of the entire Westall case, because whatever happened next happened to people who had absolutely no reason to expect it, and no shared script to describe it with. The girl at the far end of the oval stops running. She does not shout. That is the thing witnesses would remember later. There is no scream, no dramatic pointing. She just stops and tips her head back and stands very still with one hand shading her eyes. And because stillness in a moving crowd is more contagious than noise, the girl nearest her stops too. And then another. And then the whistle stops, because the teacher has turned to see why the class has gone quiet, and then the teacher stops as well. Tanya is near the middle of the field when she notices the silence. She looks up. There is an object in the sky. She will spend the rest of her life trying to describe it, and she will never once feel that she has done it properly. That is the frustrating heart of the Westall accounts. Every witness reaches for a comparison, and every comparison falls short, and the comparisons do not match each other, which is precisely what later gets used to discredit them all. But here is what Tanya sees in the first few seconds before her brain begins editing. Something silver, or grey, or the colour of an overcast sky, hanging above the tree line to the southwest. It is not shaped like an aeroplane. It has no wings that she can see, no tail, no visible propellers, no swept lines. It reads as round, or nearly round, thicker in the middle than at the edges, the way a saucer looks if you set it on a table and crouch to look at it from the side. And it is not moving the way things in the sky move. It does not cross. It hovers, and then it drifts, and then it stops, and the stopping is the part that turns Tanya's stomach cold. Aeroplanes do not stop. Clouds do not stop like that either. Only something with intent stops. The other thing she notices immediately is the sound. There isn't any. Or rather, there is a sound, but it is not the sound the object should be making. It is a low presence more than a noise, a kind of pressure at the base of her skull. The way you can sometimes feel a very large truck idling on a street you cannot see. The birds have gone quiet. That is what she will remember most sharply, decades later, more sharply than the shape or the colour. The birds in the tea trees along the fence line, which have been carrying on all morning, have simply stopped, Someone finally says something. She never remembers who. Somebody says, "What is that?" And the spell breaks, and the field erupts. Children run. That is the part that never made sense to the investigators afterward, and makes perfect sense to anyone who has been 16. The rational adult response to an unidentified object descending toward your neighbourhood is to go inside. The response of 200 teenagers is to sprint directly toward it. They pour off the oval and toward the fence. Some of them go over it. Some of them find the gap that everyone knows about down at the corner where the wire has been pushed up by years of the same shoulders. Teachers shout. The shouting has no effect whatsoever. Windows fill with faces along the length of the school building, and then those windows empty as classrooms abandon themselves and pour out into the corridors. Tanya runs with them. The grass in the paddock is longer than the grass on the oval, and it is wet at the roots, and it soaks through her shoes almost immediately. She remembers that. She remembers the specific cold of it. Ahead of her, the crowd of children is strung out across the open ground in a ragged line, all of them looking up as they run, which means half of them are stumbling. The object has moved. It is lower now, over the scrub at the far side of the Grange, past a line of pine trees, and as they run toward it, it descends, not falls, descends. There is a difference, and every witness who saw it insists on the difference. A falling object accelerates. This one lowers itself, deliberately, unhurriedly, with a kind of terrible patience, the way a hand lowers a glass onto a table. The trees take it. It goes behind them, and the world on the other side of that tree line becomes, in an instant, the most important place on the planet. Some of the children stop at the pines. Most of them do. Tanya does not. She's not brave. She wants to be very clear about this later, when she tells the story to people who assume she must have been. She's not brave, she's 16, and at 16 the fear of missing something is larger than the fear of anything else. She goes through the pines with maybe 15 or 20 others, and comes out into the open ground beyond, and there it is. Sitting in the grass. It is perhaps 200 yards away, which is close enough to see and far enough to feel safe, though safety in that moment is a category that has entirely stopped applying. It is sitting in a shallow dip in the paddock where the ground bowls slightly, and the long grass around it is flattened outward in a ring, laid down flat like hair combed away from a parting. The object is not large. That surprises her. She had expected something enormous, because the way it moved suggested enormity. But it is perhaps the size of a small house, or a large water tank. Its surface is smooth and dull, and gives back the morning light without any glare at all, which is wrong, because metal in Australian sunlight glares. This does not. It absorbs. It is the colour that a mirror would be if the mirror had decided to stop reflecting. There are no windows, no door, no seam, no rivet, no mark of manufacture anywhere on the upper surface, no wings, no rotor, no vent, no exhaust, no landing gear of any kind that she can identify from where she stands. It looks less like a vehicle than like an object, in the way a river stone is an object, something complete in itself with no visible way in, and underneath it, in the shadow it casts on the flattened grass, she sees three shapes, three circular structures set beneath the body of the craft, spaced evenly around its underside, not legs, not struts, circles, or discs, or the ends of cylinders, dark against the darker shadow. She has to squint. She's not certain she's seeing them at all, rather than inventing them out of shadow, but she looks, and she keeps looking, and they are there. 3 of them. She counts them without meaning to. 1, 2, 3. That detail, that small, unremarkable counting, is going to matter more than anything else she does that morning. But she does not know that yet. Nobody speaks. That is the other thing. 15 or 20 teenagers standing in a paddock 200 yards from an unidentified object, and none of them says a word. Some of them are crying quietly without seeming to notice they're doing it. One boy has sat down in the grass. Another is holding a camera, an old bellows thing he had brought to school for reasons nobody can later recall, and he is not using it, because he has forgotten it is in his hands. Tanya has a camera too, a small one, black, her father's, borrowed without full permission for a school project on native plants. It is in the pocket of her uniform cardigan, and it has been there all morning, and she becomes aware of it now the way you become aware of a heartbeat. She takes it out. Her hands are shaking so hard that she has to brace her elbows against her ribs. She takes a photograph. She winds the film on. The little ratcheting sound is enormous in the silence. She takes another, and then the object rises. It does it the way it came down, without effort or announcement. It simply is at one height, and then it is at another, and the flattened ring of grass beneath it stays flattened. There is a movement of air, a push, warm rather than cold, that arrives a half second after the motion and pulls at their clothes. The low pressure at the base of the skull intensifies until it is almost a taste. And then it goes. Not upward. Sideways and upward together, in one clean, unhurried curve, over the trees to the north, gathering speed as it goes in a way that does not look like acceleration, but like a decision. In 4 seconds it is a point. In 6 seconds it is nothing at all. And in the enormous silence afterward, Tanya hears something that she will think about for the rest of her life. She hears aircraft. They come in low from the south, and there are several of them, and they are moving fast. Tanya does not know aircraft types. Almost nobody in that field does. Later, witnesses would describe them variously as small, dark planes, as military trainers, as something with a heavy engine note, and the descriptions would not agree, because descriptions never do. But everyone agrees on the direction, and everyone agrees on the behaviour. The aircraft come in low over the paddocks, and they do not circle the school, and they do not orbit the landing site. They go north. They go in exactly the direction the object went, at exactly the angle the object took, and they go hard. Tanya stands with her wet shoes in the flattened grass and watches them go, and a thought arrives in her mind fully formed, the way the important thoughts always do. They are too fast. She thinks it plainly and immediately and without any theatrical sense of revelation. She simply notices, the way she notices when adults are lying, that the timing is wrong. If someone had telephoned about an object over Clayton South, a message would have to be taken. It would have to be believed. It would have to be passed to someone with authority. That person would have to decide it warranted a response. Aircraft would have to be readied. Crews would have to be found. And then those aircraft would have to fly the distance from wherever they were based. The object had been visible for perhaps 20 minutes. The aircraft arrived within moments of its departure, on its exact heading, already at speed, which means they had not been sent because of a phone call. They had already been coming. Tanya is 16 years old, standing in a paddock in her school uniform with her father's camera in her hand, and she understands something that grown men with security clearances would spend the following decades declining to say out loud. The authorities that morning were not reacting to a discovery. They were arriving late to something they had been tracking for hours. The rest of that day happens in a blur that she would later find impossible to sequence properly. Teachers arrive in the paddock, red-faced and furious and frightened in a way that children instantly recognise and find far more disturbing than anger. The students are herded back through the pines, across the paddock, over the fence, onto the oval. The headmaster is on the oval. He is not a man given to raising his voice, and he is raising it now. There is an assembly. Nobody who was there ever agrees on precisely what was said at it, but the shape of it survives in every account. They are told that they saw a weather balloon, or a light aircraft, or a trick of the light. They are told there is nothing further to discuss. They are told, and this is the part that stays with people, that they are not to talk about it. Not to each other, not at home, not to anyone who might come asking. Consider how strange that instruction is. If a school genuinely believed that 200 children had misidentified a weather balloon, the natural response would be gentle mockery. A joke at morning assembly, a short lesson in atmospheric optics. What you do not do, if you believe nothing happened, is forbid discussion of it. Forbidding discussion is what you do when something happened. By early afternoon, there are cars in the school grounds that do not belong to teachers. Some are police, some are not. Men in suits walk the corridors with the particular unhurried confidence of people who have been given permission to be anywhere they like. Students are taken out of class one at a time and ask questions in the small office next to the sick bay. Tanya is one of them. The man who talks to her that afternoon is not memorable. That is the point of him. Middle-aged, grey suit, a manner both courteous and completely uninterested in her as a person. He asks her what she saw. She tells him. He asks how big it was, and she says she does not know, and he asks her to compare it to a house, and she does. He asks about the colour, and she gives him 3 different answers because it had been 3 different colours depending on the angle. He writes that down without comment. He does not ask her a single question about what she felt, or what she thought, or whether she was frightened. He asks only about geometry, distance, and time. And at the end he says, "Thank you, that is very helpful." And then he says the thing that all of them apparently said that day, in slightly different words to slightly different children. He says, "You understand that a great many people are going to get very excited about this, and that excitement makes people remember things that did not happen." He says, "It would be a kindness to yourself not to encourage it." And Tanya, 16 and polite, says, "Yes, sir," and walks out into the corridor and stands there for a moment with her back against the cool painted brick, understanding with perfect clarity that she has just been managed. That evening the paddocks are closed. She sees it from the corner of her street, walking home the long way to look. There are vehicles at the edge of the Grange. There are men walking the flattened ring in a slow spread line, the way you walk a field when you're looking for something small. There is a smell on the air that she cannot place, and that several other witnesses would independently describe. A sharp, cool smell, like the air after lightning, or like the inside of a fridge that has just been opened. And there is a fire. The Grange burns that evening. Not the whole paddock, a section of it. The section with the flattened ring. Witnesses would describe the burning for years afterward, and the official position would be that grass fires in scrubland are entirely unremarkable, and that is true. They are, except that this one begins on the day and in the exact place where something landed, and nobody ever comes forward to say they lit it. The grass grows back within a season, because grass does, and by the time it has grown back, the story has already begun to come apart, which is exactly what the story was supposed to do. Now. The Brierley house that evening is quiet in the particular way houses are quiet when everyone in them is thinking about the same thing, and nobody is saying it. Eileen has no piano students on Wednesdays. Dinner is on the table at the usual hour. Tanya tells them what she saw, and her mother says, "Well, that is certainly something," in a tone that means we will not be discussing this at the table. Her father says nothing at all. He listens with his hands flat on either side of his plate, and he does not interrupt, and when she is finished he asks exactly one question. He asks, "How quickly did the aircraft come?" Not what did it look like. Not were you frightened. How quickly did the aircraft come? And Tanya says, "Straight away," and Arthur Brierley looks at his plate for a long moment and then says, "Right, eat your dinner." At 8:15 there is a knock at the front door. Tanya is at the kitchen table with her homework spread out in front of her and none of it done. She hears the door and her father's voice, low. She hears another voice answering, and then she hears her father say, in a tone she has never heard from him before, a tone of formal and slightly defensive politeness, "Come in then." The man who comes into the front room is not the man from the school. He's perhaps 45, thin, not tall. He has a long face and a way of holding himself that suggests he's been apologising for being in rooms his entire adult life. His suit is good, but not new. He has a briefcase that he sets down carefully rather than dropping, and a hat that he does not know what to do with and ends up holding in both hands throughout the conversation like a man at a funeral. He introduces himself as Graham Calder, and he says he is with the Department of Civil Aviation. Everything about Graham Calder from this point on is invention. There was no Graham Calder, but I want you to see him anyway, because the story needs somebody who is decent and out of his depth, and that is him entirely. He asks whether he might speak to Tanya. Arthur says that he will be present. Calder says of course, absolutely, as though that had never been in question, and sits on the edge of the good chair that nobody in the family ever sits in. And then he begins to ask questions, and within about 90 seconds Tanya understands that this man is nothing whatsoever like the man from the school. The man from the school had been collecting statements. This man is collecting data. He asks about the object's edge. Was the edge sharp or was it soft? She says soft. He nods and writes. He asks whether the colour changed as it moved or as she moved. She thinks about it properly for the first time and says, as it moved. He asks about the sound, and when she says there was not one, he does not move on. He says, no, I mean the other sound, the one that was not a sound. And Tanya goes cold all over, because she had not told anybody about that. She says, at the back of my head, like a truck idling. Calder stops writing for a moment. Then he writes. He asks about the grass. He asks whether it was flattened outward or inward, and in a spiral or in a straight radiating pattern. She says outward and straight, and he asks if she is sure, and she says yes, because she had noticed the parting. He asks about the air when it left, warm or cold. Warm, she says. And then he asks the question that ends the interview. He asks, did you see underneath it? Tanya says yes. She says that when it was sitting in the dip in the paddock, she could see into the shadow underneath it, and that there were 3 round shapes there, spaced evenly, dark against the dark. The room becomes very quiet. Graham Calder does not look up. He's holding his pen above his notebook, and he does not put it down, and he does not write. Tanya watches the tip of it hovering there, absolutely still for what feels like a long time and is probably 2 seconds. Then he closes the notebook. He asks a few more questions after that, but they are soft questions, filler questions, the kind of thing you ask to bring a conversation gently back down to earth so that you can leave without it seeming abrupt. He thanks Eileen for the tea he has not touched. He thanks Tanya for her time and tells her that she has an unusually good memory for detail, and that this is a valuable quality, and the compliment is so obviously sincere and so obviously distracted that it lands strangely. And then he goes out into the hall with Arthur, and Tanya, who is 16 and therefore both polite and shameless, follows to the kitchen doorway where she cannot be seen. She hears her father say something she does not catch, and she hears Graham Calder say, quietly, in a voice quite different from the one he had used in the front room, she's described the landing assembly. Then the front door opens and closes and a car starts in the street. Tanya goes to bed that night and lies awake for a long time in the dark, listening to the house settle, turning that sentence over. She's described the landing assembly, not she's described something unusual, not that is interesting. Landing assembly is not a phrase you reach for by accident. It is a phrase from a manual. It is a phrase from a specification. It is a phrase used by someone who is comparing a schoolgirl's description against a document he already has, which means there is a document, which means somebody has already written down what the underside of that thing looks like, which means somebody has already seen one. Let us follow Graham Calder now for a while, because the rest of the story really belongs to him. He drives home that night through the dark suburbs with the windows down because he needs the cold air, and he does not go home. He goes to his office. His office is not at the Department of Civil Aviation. That is the first lie of his professional life, and it has become so habitual that he barely feels the shape of it anymore. He's attached to civil aviation on paper, which means his salary is drawn through them and his correspondence goes through their letterhead. And if you telephoned the department and asked for him, a woman would say, "1 moment please," and put you through to a room 3 miles away. He works, in reality, for a small joint liaison unit whose full name appears on almost nothing. It is the kind of body that exists in every Allied nation in 1966. It is the plumbing of the Cold War. Its job is to take the things that turn up in Australian airspace and decide which basket they belong in. Most of them are aircraft. A few are meteorological. A very small number are Soviet, and those are exciting for a week and then handed upward and never spoken of again. And then there is the last basket, the one with no label on it. That basket is why Graham Calder cannot sleep. Since the middle of the previous year, Australian radar installations and tracking stations have been logging contacts that do not resolve. This much, in our story, is what Calder knows, and what he is not permitted to discuss. Returns that appear at altitude without an approach. Returns that hold a position for extended periods in conditions where holding a position requires either a helicopter or a miracle. Returns that change heading at rates which would, if there were a crew aboard, reduce that crew to a paste on the rear bulkhead. The initial assumption is Soviet. It is always Soviet. That is the default setting of the entire decade. And there is a period of some weeks in which the working theory is that the Soviets have developed a reconnaissance platform of an unexpected kind, and the mood in the relevant rooms is grim and focused, and in a peculiar way, comfortable, because a Soviet aircraft is a problem with a known shape. But the profiles do not fit. Not the speeds, not the accelerations, not the patterns. Soviet reconnaissance would fly routes. It would photograph things and go home. These contacts do not behave like a survey. They behave like attendants. At some point in the story, American liaison becomes involved. Not through any dramatic gesture, simply through the ordinary machinery of an alliance, in which a request for correlation goes out, and a response comes back, and a second request follows, and one day there are 2 American officers in a room that had previously contained only Australians, and after that the paperwork gets a new heading on it. In our story, that heading is Project Southern Cross. I want to be very clear again, because it matters. Southern Cross is fiction. There was no such program. I have invented it, along with everything else that follows, to give this story a spine. But the reason it feels plausible is that the real Cold War generated hundreds of programs exactly like it, with exactly those kinds of names, and most of them were about nothing at all, and a few of them were about things that still have not been fully described. Southern Cross in our story has one function. It correlates unresolved aerial contacts across Allied tracking infrastructure in the Southern Hemisphere, and it maintains a file on each of them, and by the first week of April, 1966, Southern Cross has a problem. One of the contacts is behaving oddly. It has been in the general region for several days, which is unusual, because these things typically do not linger. It has been holding at very high altitude in a rough oval over the southeastern corner of the continent, and in the 24 hours before April 6th, it begins to lose altitude in stages, which none of them have ever seen before. By the small hours of the morning of April 6th, it is low enough to be a genuine air traffic concern, and it is over Melbourne. So when Tanya Braley stands in a paddock and thinks, with the plain clarity of a 16-year-old, they are too fast, they had already been coming, she is correct. They had been watching it for days. The aircraft that morning were not scrambled. They were shadowing. Now. 10 days after Westall, Graham Calder acquires a photograph, and it changes the direction of his life. He does not acquire it legitimately. That detail matters to him a great deal, more than it probably should, because he is the kind of man who has spent 20 years being scrupulous about small things as a way of not thinking too hard about large ones. But he acquires it. There were, in reality, several people who took photographs at Westall, and the almost total absence of surviving images from an event witnessed by hundreds is one of the genuinely strange features of the real case. Cameras were present, film was exposed, and the photographic record of the most heavily witnessed daylight sighting in Australian history is essentially empty. In our story, one image survives long enough to reach Calder's desk. It is a contact print, poor quality, taken at distance and slightly out of focus, showing a pale object sitting in a paddock with a tree line behind it. He looks at it for 3 days before he sees the thing that ruins him. Under strong light, with a jeweller's loupe borrowed from a colleague on a pretext, he finds a marking on the lower body of the object. It is partially obscured and it is very small in the frame, and if you had not been staring at it for 3 days, you would take it for a flaw in the emulsion. It is a set of characters, letters and numerals, and the format of it, the arrangement, the placement, is instantly familiar to any man who spent the 1940s around Allied aircraft. It is an inventory marking. It is the kind of alphanumeric string that gets stenciled onto American military hardware so that a clerk somewhere can find it in a ledger. Calder sits back in his chair in an unheated office at 11 at night and feels something enormous unclench in his chest, and the feeling is relief, because that solves it. That solves everything. If there is an American inventory marking on the object at Westall, then Westall is not a mystery. Westall is a classified American test article that came down in the wrong paddock. The behaviour in the sky is a propulsion program nobody has announced. The rapid military response is the recovery team doing its job. The instructions to the school children are ordinary security discipline, heavy-handed and clumsy, but ordinary. The burning of the paddock is site sanitation. The refusal to explain is the refusal that every classified program makes about everything, always. Arthur Brierly, when Calder eventually shows him, reaches exactly that conclusion in about 4 seconds and is delighted by it. He says, "Well then, there you are, bloody Americans," and he laughs, and it is the laugh of a man setting down something he had not enjoyed carrying. Graham Calder does not laugh, because he has spent those 3 days doing something Arthur has not done, which is checking. An inventory marking is only useful if it corresponds to an inventory. Calder, through channels he's entitled to use and 1 or 2 he is not, runs the string. He does it carefully over several months in pieces, never asking a question large enough to attract attention. And what he finds is a whole. The format is correct. The prefix convention is correct. The character arrangement is correct. Everything about the marking is exactly what an American inventory marking should look like. And it does not correspond to anything. It is not an aircraft. It is not a test article. It is not an airframe under development, not a designation retired, not a designation reserved. It is a correctly formatted identifier for an object that does not appear in any list that Graham Calder is able to reach, and he is able to reach further than most. And in the course of looking, he stumbles across something he was not looking for. In our story, it is called Silver Veil. Silver Veil, as Calder is able to reconstruct it from fragments over the following years, begins in the early 1960s, after an incident in the Pacific. The details are thin, and he never fills them in completely. What he understands is that material was recovered, not a craft, or not an intact one. Material, fragments, components whose function could not be determined from inspection. And Silver Veil is the effort to understand it. The program has 2 arms. The first is analysis, which by all accounts goes badly. The second is reproduction, which goes worse. American engineers, some of the best in the world, spend years attempting to build something that behaves the way the recovered material suggests it should behave, and the record of it that Calder assembles is a record of intelligent people failing, repeatedly and expensively at something they cannot describe. But here is what stops him. Buried in the Silver Veil material is a procedural instruction. It is dull. It is administrative. It is the kind of paragraph that exists in every program document ever written, and that nobody reads. It concerns marking. It specifies that recovered articles, and articles produced under the program, are to carry standard inventory markings in the standard format. And Calder reads that paragraph, and reads it again, and then he goes and stands at the window of his office for a very long time. Because think about what that means. If you recover an object of unknown origin, and you stencil an American inventory number onto it, you have accomplished something remarkable. You have not hidden it. You have done something far cleverer than hiding it. You have made it boring. Anyone who subsequently sees that object, or a photograph of it, will look at the marking and conclude that it is a classified American vehicle. They will stop investigating. They will feel clever for having solved it. They will go and tell their friends that the flying saucers are all just secret aircraft, and their friends will nod, and the entire question will close. The most effective cover for something impossible is not silence. It is a plausible lie that flatters the person who discovers it. Graham Calder has spent 3 days feeling relief, and the relief itself was the trap. He had wanted the ordinary explanation so badly that he had walked straight into the arms of the thing that had been designed to give it to him. He sits back down at his desk and takes out a clean sheet of paper and writes, at the top in his small, careful hand, a single question. If the marking is meaningless, what is the object? And underneath it he begins, for the first time, to consider possibilities he has spent his entire professional life declining to consider. Now let us go back to Tanya, because the next piece belongs to her, and she does not know she is holding it. It arrives in 1968, more than 2 years after the event, and it arrives in the most ordinary way imaginable. She is 18, she has left school, she's working in an office in the city, filing, which she hates, and studying 2 nights a week, and she has stopped talking about Westall entirely, because talking about Westall has become a way of being treated as a certain kind of person. She's on a tram in the late afternoon. The sun is coming in low and gold through the windows, and she's not thinking about anything much. 2 men in front of her are having a conversation about the football, and one of them is describing a play, and he says, and meanwhile the other bloke has come round the outside, nobody's watching him, everyone's looking at the ball, everyone's looking at the ball, and Tanya Brierley sits upright on a tram in Swanston Street, with her heart going like a bird in her chest, because she has just remembered something she has known for 2 years and never once looked at. There were 2 objects. She writes to Calder that night. She still has the card he left with her father, soft at the corners from being in a drawer. They meet 3 weeks later, in a tea room, because he does not want to meet at her office and she does not want him at her house. And she tells him, she says, when we came through the pines, everyone looked down, everyone. Because the thing was on the ground, and the thing on the ground was impossible, and that is where you look. But when I first saw it from the oval, before it came down, before anybody ran, there was something else. Higher up, much higher, small, silver, not moving. She had assumed it was a plane. Of course she had. In 1966, a small silver thing very high up in a clear sky is a plane, and your brain files it accordingly and does not trouble you about it again. But when she looks at the memory now, with the specific attention of someone who has learned what to attend to, she is certain of 2 things. It was not moving. And it was still there afterward. She says, when the first one went, I looked up, and it was there. And then it wasn't. Calder sits very still in a tea room in Melbourne, with a cup going cold in front of him. He goes back to every witness statement he can reach, and this time he is not reading for the object. He is reading for the sky above the object, and he finds it, scattered through dozens of accounts, mentioned in passing, dismissed by everyone including the people who saw it. A second light, a high star, something small that nobody could make out. Statement after statement, in a corner of a sentence, going nowhere, because the investigators had all asked about the thing in the paddock. Everyone's looking at the ball, and when Graham Calder assembles those fragments into a sequence, the entire meaning of the Westall incident turns over in his hands like a card. Here is the sequence he arrives at. 2 objects, not 1. The first descends. It descends in stages over more than a day, which is not how anything travels and is exactly how something fails. It comes down in a paddock beside a school, which is the last place on earth that anything conducting a covert operation would choose, and the only kind of place that something in trouble ends up. The second remains at altitude, holding position for the entire duration. The military aircraft come in low and go north, on the departure heading hard. The first object recovers and departs. and then the second object departs on the same heading immediately afterward. Read that sequence again with fresh eyes. That is not a test. Nobody tests a vehicle by having it sink slowly toward a suburb for a day and a half. That is not a deployment, and it is not a display, and it is emphatically not an experiment. That is an accident and an escort. The thing at altitude was not observing the school. It was observing the other object. It was standing off, at height, watching a vehicle in difficulty, and it stayed exactly as long as that vehicle was down, and it left the instant that vehicle was up, and the aircraft were not escorting either of them. They were chasing both, which means the Royal Australian Air Force did not arrive at Westall to manage a secret. It arrived to attempt an interception in daylight over a residential suburb, and it failed in front of 200 children. That is the moment Graham Calder stops being an investigator and becomes something closer to a man with an obsession. Because if that reading is correct, then Westall is not a story about what people saw. It is a story about what somebody was chasing over Melbourne in 1966, and about what they were chasing it with, and what they thought they were chasing, and what they found in the grass when it was over. It takes him until 1971 to find the report. It comes to him the way these things always come, which is not through cleverness but through patience and one unhappy man. There is a person in the story, and I will not give him a name because Calder never did in his notes, who has spent 5 years being asked to sign things he does not agree with, and who one evening in a pub near Russell Street decides he has had enough of it. He does not hand over documents. He does something much smaller and much more dangerous. He tells Graham Calder where to look and what the file is called, and Calder does the rest over 11 months. What he eventually reads is 4 pages long, typed, with corrections in pencil, and it concerns a recovery. At some point on the afternoon of April 6th, 1966, personnel conducting a ground search of the area southeast of the landing site located an unconscious male. That is how it opens. Flat as a shopping list. Located an unconscious male. He was in the scrub, roughly 400 yards from the flattened ring, in a position consistent with someone who had been moving away from the site under his own power and had then stopped moving. He was not injured in any way the report describes as significant. He was breathing. His pulse was rapid but regular. He responded to stimulus within a few minutes and was fully conscious inside a quarter of an hour. He was wearing a garment described in the report as a flight suit of unfamiliar pattern. One piece, close-fitting, no insignia, no rank, no name tape, no unit marking, no manufacturer's label anywhere on or inside it. The material is described in a phrase that Calder underlines twice in his own copy. The material is described as not obviously woven. He carried no identification. No wallet, no papers, no tags, no keys, no coins, nothing in any pocket, and the report notes, with what reads like faint irritation, that the garment did not appear to have pockets, and he was, in every respect that anybody could determine, a human being. I want to sit with that for a moment, because it is the hinge of the whole story, and it is easy to rush past it. Everything about the Westall incident up to this point has been building toward one of two conclusions. Either it was ours, meaning some nation's secret machine, or it was theirs, meaning something from somewhere else entirely. Those are the only two doors in the room. Every UFO story you have ever heard goes through one of them, and here is a man found in the grass beside the thing, and he does not fit through either door. He is medically examined at a facility that the report does not name. His blood is drawn and typed, and it is an ordinary blood type. His chest is X-rayed, and his skeleton is an ordinary human skeleton, with an old healed fracture in the left forearm. He has fillings in his teeth. He has a small appendectomy scar. His eyesight is slightly poor in one eye. He is roughly 30 years old, of average height, and the report notes that he is in unusually good physical condition for a man of that age, and then, as though embarrassed by the observation, moves on. He is not an alien. Whatever else is true, he is not an alien. He is a man of about 30 with a scar and a healed arm and a filling in a molar. The initial assumption, obviously, is that he is American. That is the only assumption available. He came out of a machine with an American inventory marking on it. Therefore he is an American test pilot. Therefore this is an embarrassing diplomatic matter and not a metaphysical one. And everybody in the room is enormously relieved. The Americans are asked. The Americans say no. And here Calder's notes become extremely careful, because he knows exactly how much weight that word can bear. Allied nations lie to each other constantly, especially about aviation, and a denial is worth very little. But he tracks the tone of the exchange through the paperwork over several weeks, and what he finds is not the shape of a lie. A lie has a texture, it is bland, and it closes the subject. This is not bland. The American response, as it develops across a series of messages, becomes progressively more urgent and more specific. They ask for the fingerprints. They get them. They ask for dental records. They get those. They ask for photographs. They get those too. And then they ask a question that Calder finds so revealing that he copies it out by hand into his private notebook. They ask whether the individual has stated a date. Not a name, not a nationality, not a unit. A date. Which means that somebody in the American system already knew what question to ask, which means somebody in the American system had done this before. The fingerprints incidentally produce nothing, not a partial match, not a near miss. He's not in any file, in any country that anyone thinks to check. He is interviewed. That is the word the report uses, and Calder notes dryly in the margin that he doubts it was as gentle as the word implies. He is cooperative. That surprises everyone. He does not resist, does not attempt to leave, does not demand anything. He answers questions about how he feels and whether he is in pain. He asks for water and thanks the person who brings it. But he will not say where he is from, and he will not say what the vehicle was, and when asked directly he simply looks at his hands and says nothing at all. And there is a quality to the silence, one interviewer notes, of a man declining to explain something to a child rather than a man hiding something from an enemy. And then, on the second day, someone tells him the date. It happens by accident. It is not a technique and nobody intends anything by it. An officer is filling out a form at the table and reads the header aloud while writing, the way people do, and says the date, the 6th of April 1966, and the man comes apart. The report describes it in that bloodless institutional register that somehow makes it worse. Subject became acutely distressed. Subject required physical restraint for a period of approximately 2 minutes. Subject repeatedly requested confirmation of the date and, upon receiving it, ceased responding to questions for the remainder of the session. Read that again. He is calm when he is captured by an unknown military. He's calm when he is stripped and examined and photographed and printed. He's calm through a day and a half of interrogation by people who have every reason to frighten him, and he breaks when they tell him what day it is. Graham Calder, sitting in his kitchen in 1971 with 4 typed pages in front of him, understands that he has spent 5 years asking the wrong question. He had been asking, where did it come from? The right question was, when? Now, before we follow that thread all the way down, let us talk about the cover-up, because the cover-up is the part of this story that is genuinely and provably strange, and it is the part that requires no invention at all. Here is the problem, as it appeared to the authorities on the afternoon of April 6, 1966. You have an object down in a paddock. You have a man in custody who should not exist. And you have, as your central and completely insoluble difficulty, somewhere between 200 and 300 witnesses, most of whom are children, all of whom have gone home to their families, and every single one of whom is at this moment describing what they saw at the dinner table. You cannot contain this. There is no mechanism on earth for containing this. You cannot make 300 people forget. You cannot silence a whole suburb. You cannot even reliably silence one teenage girl, as Graham Calder is going to discover across the next 30 years. So you do not try. And this is the genuinely elegant, genuinely disturbing insight at the centre of the Westall story. Whether you take the fictional layer or not, you do not need to erase an event, you only need to make sure it never resolves. A story that is denied becomes a scandal. A story that is confirmed becomes history. But a story that is answered in 6 different incompatible ways at once becomes an argument, and an argument does not go anywhere. It just runs, and eventually the people having it get old. So the explanations arrive, and they arrive in abundance. It was a weather balloon. Specifically, it was a target balloon, released from a nearby facility, drifting across the school and down into the paddock. This explanation is offered early, and it is offered often, and it has the enormous advantage of being almost true, because balloons were released, and balloons do drift, and children do misidentify them. It was an experimental aircraft. This one is never officially stated, only allowed to circulate, and it is by far the most attractive explanation to adults, because it is exciting without being impossible, and it makes the person who believes it feel like an insider. It was a light aircraft in difficulty. It was the sun on a cloud. It was a trick of the atmosphere. It was mass hysteria among schoolchildren, and this one is particularly effective, because it does not require anyone to have lied. It merely requires everyone to have been young and excitable, and every adult in 1966 is entirely prepared to believe that about teenagers. It was aliens, and this, in a way, is the most useful explanation of them all, because the moment the word is in the room, the entire subject is contaminated. Anyone who investigates seriously must first spend 20 minutes establishing that they are not a crank, and most serious people will simply decline the entire topic rather than do that. 6 explanations, each one supported by some witnesses, each one contradicted by others, each one plausible enough to keep alive and weak enough never to win. Nobody had to burn the file. They just had to let everyone talk, and by 1970, if you asked a person in Melbourne what happened at Westall, they would tell you that something happened, probably, and then they would shrug, and the shrug is the whole objective. The shrug is the finished product. Everything else was just the process of manufacturing it. Westall did not vanish from history. It was left permanently unresolved, which is a far more durable form of disappearance, because a hole in the record invites investigation, and a mess in the record invites nothing at all. The years pass, the way years do, quietly and all at once. Tanya Briley becomes Tanya someone else for a while, and then becomes Tanya Briley again. She has 2 children. She works and retires, and takes up gardening with the seriousness that people reserve for things they discover late. She goes to a reunion in the 1990s and meets a man she had not seen since he was 15, and the 2 of them stand near the drinks table talking about nothing for a few minutes. And then he says, out of nowhere, "You were there, weren't you?" And she says yes, and neither of them says anything else about it, and they both feel enormously better. Graham Calder dies in the winter of 2004. He is 83. He has been retired for a long time. He never married. He's buried in Melbourne in the presence of 11 people, one of whom is Tanya. And it is because of that funeral that the last part of this story exists at all, because his sister, who is very old and very tired and does not want to deal with any of it, presses a box of papers on Tanya afterward and says, "He wrote to you. I know he did. You take them. I can't be doing with it." Tanya takes the box home and puts it in the spare room and does not open it for 4 months. Now, the other thing. Arthur Briley had died years earlier, in 1987, and Tanya had cleared his house herself over a long grey week, and among the things she had found and kept and not thought about since was a tobacco tin. It is in the back of the wardrobe. It has always been in the back of the wardrobe, in her house now, since 87, holding buttons and a broken watch and a spare key to a door that no longer exists, and a roll of film. She finds it in 2005, looking for something else entirely, which is how everything important is found. It is a small black canister, and the film inside it has never been developed, and Tanya sits down on the floor of her spare room with it in her hand and remembers. with a completeness that takes the breath out of her, standing in wet grass with her elbows braced against her ribs. They had taken her camera. That afternoon at the school, one of the men had asked whether anyone had photographed anything, and she had said yes, and she had handed it over, and it had come back a week later with the film gone, and a polite note about how helpful she had been. She had photographed the paddock and lost the pictures, and never thought about it again. But her father had kept a roll. She never learns how. He is 19 years dead, and there is nobody left to ask. Perhaps he had swapped it. Perhaps the roll in the camera was a different one, and this was the one from her pocket. Perhaps he simply took it out and put it in a tin in 1966 and said nothing, ever, to anyone for 21 years. Which of all the possibilities is the one that sounds most like Arthur Brierly? Film that old is not reliable. The laboratory tells her that. 40 years in a tin in a wardrobe in Melbourne, through 40 summers, is not how anyone would recommend storing anything. Most of it comes back as nothing. Fog. Grey. The chemical ghost of light that decayed long ago. 11 frames survive well enough to see. 7 are worthless. Sky. The back of somebody's head. A blurred smear of pine trees. Somebody's shoes. 3 are extraordinary and heartbreaking in the ordinary way, which is that they are photographs of teenagers in 1966 standing in long grass with their faces turned up. And Tanya knows every one of them, and half of them are dead. And the 11th frame has the object in it. It is not a good photograph. It is small in the frame and slightly soft, and the exposure is wrong. But it is there. A pale shape sitting in a dip in a paddock, with the grass laid flat around it in a ring, and the tree line behind, and the enormous clean sky of that autumn morning above it. And underneath it, in the shadow, 3 circles. She sits with that for a long time. Then she has it enlarged and enhanced at a place that does restoration work, by a young man who does not ask what he is looking at, and to whom she does not offer any explanation whatsoever. And in the enhancement there is a person, standing beside the craft, to the left of it, at the edge of the flattened ring, perhaps 20 feet from the body of the object. Small in the frame, a figure in something pale and close-fitting, one piece, no visible detail. Tanya's first reaction, when she sees it, is relief. The same relief Graham Calder felt with a jeweller's loop in 1966. Because a man beside a machine is an ordinary thing. A man beside a machine is a pilot. A pilot means a program, and a program means a government, and a government means the world is the way she has always been told it is. She holds that relief for about 90 seconds. Then she looks at his posture. He is not standing. He is caught mid-stride, and the stride is long, and his upper body is pitched forward, and one arm is up and back in the way that arms are when a person is running flat out. This is not a technician walking to his vehicle. This is a man sprinting, and he is not sprinting toward it. His back is to the craft. Every line of him is pointed away, out toward the scrub, out toward the open country to the southeast. He's running away from the thing that brought him. 400 yards southeast, in the scrub, is where they found him. Now. The box of Calder's papers sits in that spare room for 4 months, and then Tanya opens it, and it takes her the better part of a year to work through, because Graham Calder was a meticulous man who wrote everything down and threw nothing away. There are notebooks going back to 1966. There are carbon copies. There are letters to people who never wrote back. There is a folder of correspondence with witnesses that spans 30 years, and Tanya is in it, and so are dozens of others. And reading it, she realizes that he never stopped. He retired from the department in 1981, and he did not stop for a single year. And near the bottom, in a plain manila folder, there is the last notebook. The first thing in it is a page of medical detail, copied by hand, about a man of approximately 30 years with a healed fracture of the left forearm. The second thing is a transcript fragment, also copied by hand 3 lines long. An investigator asks the man which country manufactured his aircraft, and the man says, "You haven't made it yet." Calder has written underneath in pencil, in handwriting that has become noticeably older than the handwriting at the front of the book, "Recorded as insolence, reviewed and closed," and underneath that, in ink, it was not insolence, it was a correction. Think about the difference. Insolence would be, you couldn't build it. Insolence would be, you'll never make it. Mockery has a shape, and that shape is contempt. You haven't made it yet is not contempt. It is a man correcting the tense of a question. It is what you say when someone asks who made a thing, and the honest answer is that the making has not happened. Yet. The rest of the notebook is Graham Calder's last 3 years of work, and what it contains is a list. He has taken the major unexplained aerial incidents of the 20th century, the ones that are documented, the ones that generated real files in real archives in real countries, and he has laid them out by date. 1947 and everything that followed. The wave over Washington in the summer of 1952. The cases that clustered around air bases and coastlines and testing grounds through the 50s, Westall in 1966, the incidents through the 70s at missile installations, on, decade by decade in his small, careful hand. And beside that list he has put a second one, nuclear tests, weapons development milestones, the first detonations, the first thermonuclear device, the first intercontinental missile, the moments when a war began or ended or nearly happened, the Cuban crisis, the technological thresholds one after another that the 20th century crossed and could not uncross. And the two lists do not match perfectly, because nothing in the real world matches perfectly, but they rhyme. The unexplained things appear where the important things are happening, not everywhere, not randomly. They cluster around the moments that a future historian would put in bold. For 20 years, Calder writes, we asked why they are so interested in our weapons. We assumed the answer was fear. We assumed they were assessing a threat, but that is not what the pattern looks like. A threat assessment would be comprehensive. It would examine everything, evenly, the way you survey a country you intend to invade. This is not comprehensive. This is selective. It is not the pattern of somebody trying to find out what matters. It is the pattern of somebody who already knows what mattered. And that is where Graham Calder arrives, at the end of a life spent on this, alone, in his 80s, writing in a notebook that nobody will read for a decade. They were not exploring us. They were visiting. The objects were not surveying an unknown civilization to learn its capabilities. They were arriving at the specific moments that a person looking backward would consider significant. They were doing what you would do if you had a machine and a map of history and a professional interest in the 20th century. They came to the beginning of the atomic age because that is where the atomic age begins, and you cannot see a beginning from inside it. The craft at Westall was not built on another world. It was built on this one. The metal came out of an ordinary furnace somewhere. The man inside it had a filling in a molar, put there by a dentist, and a fracture in his left forearm from falling off something as a child on this planet in a year that has not happened yet. Something went wrong. That much is obvious from the descent profile alone. Nothing arrives by sinking through the atmosphere in stages over a day and a half, unless something has failed. The second vehicle stood off at altitude and watched, because that is what you do when the vehicle beside you is in difficulty and there is nothing you can do to help it. And they were seen in daylight by hundreds of children over an ordinary suburb on an ordinary Wednesday. And when the first vehicle finally recovered enough to leave, it left in a hurry, and it left with the second one following it. And one of them was not aboard. That is the terror that Graham Calder believed he was reading in that 4-page report. Not a man frightened of his captors. A man who has been left behind standing in the wreck of a mission that has gone catastrophically wrong, being asked questions by people in uniforms that belong in a museum, and then someone reads him the date off a form, the 6th of April, 1966. And the number he hears is not just a date, it is a distance. It is the measurement of how far he is from everyone he has ever known, in a direction that does not have a road going back. He asks them to say it again. That is in the report. Subject repeatedly requested confirmation of the date. He was not confused. He was hoping he had misheard. And here is the final turn, the one that Calder writes on the last used page of the notebook, and it is the reason this story has stayed with me since the day I first read about that schoolyard. The children of Westall have spent their whole lives being told they might have witnessed humanity's first contact with something from beyond the world. Calder's conclusion is stranger than that, and lonelier. They did not witness a meeting between humanity and something else. They witnessed humanity meeting itself, across a gap of years that nobody in that paddock could have counted. 200 children in school uniforms standing in wet grass, looking up at their own descendants, and neither side able to say a single word to the other. And the last thing in the notebook, at the bottom of the page, is one line, and it is not analysis. It is just an old man thinking out loud. He wrote, "They visit the moments they know became important." And then, underneath, Westall was not supposed to be one of them. It became one because something went wrong. Welcome back to Sleep Theories. A huge thank you to Stuart for suggesting tonight's story. I love when the community drives where we go next, and this one did not disappoint. If you have a topic you would love to hear covered here, drop it in the comments below. Every suggestion gets read, and you might just hear your idea turn into the next documentary. And if Sleep Theories has become part of your nighttime routine, a quick review on Spotify would mean the world. It takes about 30 seconds, and it is genuinely one of the best ways to help new listeners find their way to us. Now, let us begin. Welcome back to Sleep Theories. Before we begin tonight, a genuine thank you to everyone who's been leaving comments about your locations and time zones. It means the world to know that voices from Tokyo and Toronto and Cape Town and Manchester are all finding their way here, settling in for the night, letting these stories carry them somewhere else for a little while. If you are new here, drop your location in the comments below. We love knowing where in the world you're listening from, and if Sleep Theories has become part of your nighttime routine, please consider leaving us a review on Spotify. It helps more than you know, and every single one gets read. Now, tonight's story is unlike most of the cases we have covered here. It does not begin with a body, or a crash, or a moment of catastrophic violence. It begins with a knock at the door, a polite knock. A well-dressed woman on the step, a clipboard under her arm, a smile that seems entirely professional. She introduces herself as being from the council, from social services, hear about the children. And then she asks, quite calmly, if she might step inside and speak with your child alone. That is where the story begins. That is where, for dozens of families across Great Britain during the 1980s and 1990s, something shifted. That is the moment people would remember for decades afterward. Not because of what happened next, but because of what could not be explained about what came before. The case has no official name. There is no Scotland Yard file with a suspect profile attached to it. There is no conviction, no inquest, no resolved outcome. What there is, what has always been there, buried in local newspaper archives and dusty council records and the long memories of ordinary people, is a pattern. A pattern so consistent, so geographically widespread and so stubbornly unexplained that it has become one of the most quietly unnerving social mysteries of late 20th century Britain. Investigators, journalists and amateur researchers have taken to calling it simply the Phantom Social Worker. To understand why this case matters, why it disturbs even those who come to it decades later with fresh eyes, you have to understand the particular vulnerability that was being exploited, or, if the official explanation is correct, the particular fear that took root in the minds of an entire generation of British parents. Because the 1980s were not a simple time to be a family in the United Kingdom. Social services were not a simple thing to be involved with, and the relationship between ordinary households and the machinery of government welfare was charged in those years, with a tension that few people today fully appreciate. This is the story of the Phantom Social Worker, and when you hear everything that was reported, everything that was documented and then quietly lost and then partially recovered, you will have to decide for yourself what you believe happened. Tonight, we are going to go all the way to the beginning. The earliest credible reports surface in North London sometime in the early 1980s. The precise year is difficult to pinpoint because the initial incidents were not treated as significant enough to warrant formal investigation. They were recorded as neighbourhood complaints, filed, locally and largely forgotten within weeks. But the families who experienced them did not forget. Several of these accounts were later reconstructed through interviews conducted by local journalists and community organisations during the years that followed, and they share a remarkable uniformity of detail that, viewed in retrospect, is one of the most striking aspects of the entire phenomenon. The visitor was a woman, always a woman, in the earliest reports. She appeared to be in her 30s or 40s, well presented, dressed in the kind of smart but unremarkable clothing that suggests professionalism without ostentation. She carried either a clipboard or a folder of documents. Witnesses differed on the precise form, and she spoke with the measured, slightly formal tone that people in that era associated with council workers, NHS visitors, and government officials of every kind. She said she was from social services. She said she was following up on a welfare concern that had been raised about the family. She asked to come in. Most families, confronted with this presentation at their own front door, let her in. This was not naive. This was not a failure of judgment. In the Britain of the early 1980s, a visit from social services was not something most working-class or middle-class families felt empowered to challenge or refuse. The machinery of the welfare state carried an implicit authority, and the idea that refusing to cooperate with a social worker could itself be used as evidence against you, evidence that you had something to hide, something to protect your children from scrutiny about, was a very real and very reasonable fear. So people let her in. They made tea, perhaps. They sat down. And then she said something that made the atmosphere in the room change. She needed to speak with the children alone. She said this as though it were routine, as though this was simply how these assessments were conducted, as though a mother or father remaining in the room while a stranger spoke privately with their child was somehow unusual, somehow improper, somehow contrary to professional procedure. And this is the moment, this precise moment, where the accounts begin to diverge in their outcomes but remain completely unified in their emotional texture. Because every family who reported this encounter described the same thing, a cold, vertiginous sense that something was deeply wrong. Some parents complied. They stepped out of the room, into the kitchen, into the hallway, for what they were told would be only a few minutes. Others refused. They said they would stay. They asked for identification. And this is where the second extraordinary detail of the pattern emerges. When challenged, when a parent asked to see a badge, a council letter, some official documentation, the woman's response was not irritation, not insistence, not the kind of professional firmness you might expect from someone being questioned in the legitimate exercise of their duties. Her response was retreat. Swift, clean, almost practiced retreat. She would say something vague, that she must have the wrong address, or that she would need to come back with the correct paperwork, and then she would leave, quickly, before the parent had time to ask anything further, before anyone could note down a registration plate or confirm a department name. She was gone. Those parents who reported the encounter to their local police stations found that officers took the details down politely and did very little else. There was no known welfare concern on record at the council. There was no visit scheduled. There was no employee whose description matched the woman's. And since no crime had been committed, since the woman had simply knocked on a door, asked some questions and left, there was limited appetite within overstretched local police forces to treat the matter as a serious investigation. The reports were logged. They were filed. And they were, for the most part, forgotten. But the pattern did not stop. Through the mid-1980s, similar reports began emerging from across the country with a frequency that, taken together, is genuinely difficult to dismiss. In the Midlands, a woman matching the description spent several weeks working through a particular estate in Wolverhampton, calling on families with young children, asking the same questions, retreating at the same moment of challenge. In Yorkshire, parents in at least 3 separate towns reported near-identical encounters within a span of several months. In South London, a community newsletter published a warning specifically advising parents to ask for credentials before allowing any unannounced social worker into their homes, a warning prompted by a cluster of unverified visits that had been circulating through the neighbourhood by word of the mouth for the better part of a year. The regional newspapers picked up fragments of the story. Headlines appeared, warnings to parents, calls for vigilance, vague references to impersonation. The phrase phantom social worker began to circulate in tabloid coverage, initially used almost humorously in the manner of the era's appetite for strange human interest peculiarities, but gradually acquiring a darker undertone as the volume of reports made humour feel less appropriate. By the late 1980s, the phrase had become established enough that people encountering a suspicious doorstep visit knew exactly what to call it. The national response from authorities, when it finally came, was measured and dismissive in equal proportion. Local councils released statements confirming that no organised impersonation scheme had been identified. Police spokespeople offered the same cluster of explanations that would be repeated, with minor variations for years, that many of the reports likely involved genuine social workers whose visits had been misunderstood or misremembered. That rumour and community anxiety could cause people to interpret routine encounters through a distorted lens. That some reports might be the result of inter-neighbour gossip, transforming ambiguous incidents into something more sinister in the retelling. The official narrative was, essentially, that frightened people were seeing threats where none existed. And perhaps that is the simplest explanation. Fear is contagious. The 1980s were a decade in which British public discourse about child welfare had become intensely, almost feverishly heightened. Several high-profile cases of institutional abuse, cases in which the welfare system itself had failed children catastrophically, were working their way into public consciousness with the slow, grinding force of an emerging scandal. The Cleveland child abuse controversy of 1987, in which hundreds of children were removed from their families on the basis of disputed medical diagnoses, had torn apart communities and made the relationship between ordinary families and social services a live, contested, deeply anxiety-laden thing. In this atmosphere, the idea of a threatening figure operating under the cover of social services authority was not a paranoid fantasy. It was an entirely coherent expression of existing social terror. But then there are the details that complicate this comfortable explanation. Then there are the things that a journalist named Daniel Harper, working on a retrospective investigation into historical British child welfare controversies, some 2 decades after the peak of the phantom social worker reports, found himself unable to reconcile with the simple story of mass misperception. Harper came to the case sideways, as investigators so often do. He was not looking for the phantom social worker. He was researching the broader landscape of British child protection policy during the 1980s, a legitimate, serious, well-funded academic-adjacent project that required him to spend considerable time in local newspaper archives and records offices, and it was in those archives that he kept finding her. Brief items, clipped from regional papers, a notice here, a warning there, a short report of a complaint lodged and dismissed. The cumulative volume of these references was greater than he had expected. It was, he later wrote, like discovering that every local paper in Britain had reported a different corner of the same painting. A painting that, when the corners were assembled together, showed something no one had meant to show. What Harper found as he began the painstaking work of cross-referencing accounts across regions and decades was that the behavioural pattern attributed to the phantom social worker was not merely consistent, it was, in his words, almost algorithmically precise. The professional appearance, the welfare concern framing, the request to see children alone, the immediate departure when challenged. Across dozens of separate reports from North London to West Yorkshire to the East Midlands, these 4 elements appeared together like a signature. Not similar, identical. And this, Harper argued, was the thing that made the mass misperception explanation begin to strain. Rumours spread and mutate. This is their nature. The game of telephone, the childhood experiment in which a message passed through many mouths arrives at the end transformed almost beyond recognition, illustrates a fundamental truth about the way human memory and communication work. If the phantom social worker was nothing more than a collective hallucination generated by community anxiety, you would expect the accounts to show exactly this kind of drift. You would expect some reports to describe a man, others a woman, some to mention a clipboard, others nothing, some to describe the stranger asking to be left alone with children, others to describe something else entirely. You would expect the noise that always attends the amplification of rumour. And yet the signal, across all these reports, was strikingly clean. Harper began requesting access to the original police incident reports, not the summaries that had appeared in newspapers, but the primary documents themselves, the handwritten contemporaneous records that constables had filed when parents came to stations to report their encounters. And this is where the investigation encountered its first serious obstruction. Many of the reports referenced in newspaper articles from the period, reports that had been publicly acknowledged, that had been cited in council statements, that had formed the evidential basis for the official dismissals, were no longer in the archives, not restricted, not redacted, gone. The explanations offered by the relevant police departments were consistent and individually entirely plausible. Records from the 1980s, they explained, had been subject to a series of database migrations and digitization programs across the 1990s and early 2000s. During these migrations, pre-digital records that had been assessed as having no ongoing investigative relevance, which would include closed, unresolved complaint files of exactly this kind, had been subject to routine destruction in accordance with standard records retention schedules. The loss of the specific documents Harper was seeking was entirely consistent with normal administrative practice. There was nothing suspicious about it. It was, the departments emphasised, completely standard. Harper did not find this entirely satisfying for one reason. The paper indexes, the physical ledgers that had been maintained in police stations before computerisation, the handwritten logs that listed every report received and every file created, still existed in some archives, and in those indexes the entries for the missing reports were present. The reports had existed, their reference numbers were there, the dates were there, the initiating officers' names were there, and in several cases there were brief annotations in the index margins, the kind of informal notes that clerical staff sometimes added to help them navigate the filing system, that suggested the reports had been cross-referenced with something. With what, the indexes did not say. The cross-reference codes pointed to file categories that Harper could not identify within the surviving archive system. It is important to be precise about what this does, and does not mean. The existence of missing files and unidentified cross-references does not, in itself, prove anything. Administrative chaos is the normal condition of large bureaucratic systems. Files go missing for entirely mundane reasons. Cross-reference codes become orphaned and unreadable when the systems that generated them are retired. None of this required a conspiratorial explanation. Harper was clear about this in his own writing. He was not, he insisted, claiming that the missing files had been deliberately destroyed. He was noting that their absence made it impossible to determine whether the official explanation, mass misperception, was as well supported by the primary evidence as authorities had always suggested. But then there was the interview that Harper conducted with a retired social services employee, a woman who had worked for a London Borough Council throughout the 1980s and into the 90s, and who agreed to speak with Harper only on condition of anonymity, that shifted the texture of the investigation in a way that was difficult to entirely explain away. She had spent her career in the frontline welfare system. She knew the protocols, the paperwork, the professional culture of the period intimately, and she told Harper something that he had not expected. The rumours about impersonation had circulated within social services departments themselves, not loudly, not officially, not in any form that was ever committed to writing, but they had been there. Staff had known. There had been conversations, informal and cautious, about a pattern of doorstep incidents that bore no relation to any authorised visits, and at some point, she could not say precisely when or under what authority, a quiet instruction had been issued to frontline staff. Parents, when they sought advice from social services offices about suspicious doorstep callers, were to be advised to always ask for identification. Staff were to be reminded that no authorised social worker would ever insist on speaking with a child without a parent or guardian present. These were the standard protocols, the woman explained, the protocols that should always have been followed. But the specific timing and framing of the reminder, the fact that it was issued at all as a discrete instruction rather than a simple rehearsal of existing policy, told her that someone, somewhere, had decided the pattern was real enough to require a response. She had asked once what the impersonation incidents were about. She had asked a senior colleague who seemed better informed than most. The answer she received was short and discouraging. She was told that the matter was being handled at a level above the operational. She was told not to raise it in written correspondence. She was told that the last thing anyone needed was a public panic about the safety of children in their own homes. And she had, as one did in those years within large institutional systems that carried the weight of professional consequence, let the matter drop. The intelligence angle, the suggestion that the phantom social worker incidents might have been connected to something beyond ordinary criminal impersonation, belongs primarily to the more speculative reaches of the conspiracy theory literature that has grown up around the case. It would be irresponsible to present these theories as established fact, and Harper himself was careful not to do so. But they deserve to be examined because they illuminate the broader historical context in which these events occurred, and because the circumstantial threads, though none of them constitute proof, are individually intriguing. The 1980s were not only a period of heightened anxiety about child welfare, they were also the tail end of the Cold War, a period in which the British security services were deeply enmeshed in a wide range of domestic surveillance and social research programs, some of which remained entirely classified until decades later, and some of which, when they did eventually surface, proved to be considerably more intrusive and ethically questionable than the public had been led to believe. The Spycatcher affair, which broke in 1987, revealed the existence of MI5 domestic operations that had been conducted without parliamentary oversight or public knowledge. The extent of covert social research conducted under the banner of national security during this period, research into political affiliation, community organisation, family structure, and the socialisation of children, has never been fully disclosed. Several researchers working on the margins of the phantom social worker case have pointed to a specific strand of Cold War social research that was conducted in Britain and in the United States during the 1960s, 70s and early 80s, research into the structure and vulnerability of family units under conditions of stress, social disruption and authority challenge. The hypothesis, floated carefully, never definitively advanced, is that the phantom social worker visits may have been a form of field research, unauthorised, compartmentalised, conducted by operatives or contractors working under some form of institutional cover designed to study how families responded to authority-based doorstep, intrusion. What happened when a figure of official authority knocked on a door and made a specific, deeply uncomfortable request? What percentage of families complied? What variables, social class, neighbourhood type, previous welfare system contact, predicted compliance or refusal? How did families process and report the encounter afterward? No documentation supporting this hypothesis has ever been produced. No whistleblower has come forward with specific institutional knowledge. The government has never acknowledged any programme of this description. It belongs firmly and unambiguously in the realm of conjecture. Compelling conjecture, perhaps, in light of what we now know about the scope of Cold War domestic surveillance programs on both sides of the Atlantic, but conjecture nonetheless. Harper himself described the intelligence angle as a theoretical framework that happened to fit the available evidence rather uncomfortably well, while acknowledging that fitting the evidence and being supported by the evidence were two fundamentally different things. There is a third possibility that sits between the two main competing explanations, between mass misperception and coordinated impersonation, and it is, in some ways, the most disturbing of all. It is the possibility that the phantom social worker was real, singular, and operating entirely alone. A single individual, deeply familiar with the procedures and presentation of social services, travelling methodically across the country, gaining access to homes and children for reasons that were never identified and never interrupted. The behavioural consistency that Harper found so striking would, under this hypothesis, be not the signature of institutional organisation but the signature of a single, disciplined, purposeful person. One woman, one clipboard, one practised line of inquiry, hundreds of families, decades of access, and yet no one was ever arrested, no suspect was ever identified, no name was ever attached to the description. The woman who knocked on all those doors, if she was real, if she was one woman, if she was doing what the most alarming reading of the evidence suggests she might have been doing, walked away from every single encounter without consequence. She was never caught in the act, never photographed, never detained, never explained. The people who opened their doors to her are older now. Some are gone. The children she asked to speak with alone are adults. Adults who in most cases probably never knew what their parents reported, never knew what questions had been asked in the local police station afterward, never knew that their particular family had been one entry in a pattern that stretched from London to the north of England and back again. What those children experienced, if they experienced anything, is unknown. What happened in the rooms that their parents stepped out of, in the cases where parents did step out, this too is unknown. This is perhaps the most unbearable part of the entire case, not the conspiracy, not the missing files, not the retired employee's careful, frightened confidence. The unbearable part is the simple and total absence of answers. Harper published his investigation as a long-form piece in a small but respected current affairs journal. The response was significant enough to generate coverage in several national newspapers, a brief flurry of online discussion, and a handful of additional witness accounts from people who had been waiting, apparently, for someone to take the subject seriously enough to write about it properly. Several of these additional accounts came from the children, now adults, who had been the ostensible subjects of the visits. Most of them had been too young at the time to have clear memories, but a few had been old enough to remember something. They remembered a woman. They remembered being asked about their home life, their school, their friends. They remembered that their parents had seemed frightened after the woman left, though the children had not understood why at the time. They remembered that the subject had never been explained to them, that it had become one of those family episodes that existed as a kind of silent, pressurized absence in household memory, a thing that happened and was never discussed. The official position on the phantom social worker case, to the extent that any official position exists, remains what it has always been: an unexplained social panic, probably the product of rumour amplified by community anxiety, in a period when anxiety about child welfare and social services authority was already running high. The missing records are an administrative artifact. The behavioural consistency of witness accounts reflects the distorting power of collective narrative. There is nothing to investigate because there was never anything to find. For most mainstream historians of late 20th century British social policy, this explanation is adequate. The 1980s produced several moral panics of considerable intensity. Panics about video nasties, about satanic ritual abuse, about a dozen other threats that turned out, on careful examination, to be products of social fear rather than documented reality. The phantom social worker fits this context comfortably enough. She belongs, in the orthodox reading, on the shelf alongside other figures from the decade's collective nightmares. Not real, but expressive. Not a threat, but a symbol of the fear that threat was possible. And yet there are those reports from families in different cities who had never heard of each other, describing the same 4 behavioural elements in the same sequence. There is the retired social services worker describing internal protocols issued in response to something real enough to require a response. There are the missing files, and the cross-references that lead nowhere, and the paper index, entries that record a thing that can no longer be read. There is the cold, precise consistency of a pattern that should, if it were nothing but rumour, have frayed at the edges long ago. The phantom social worker has never been identified. No photograph of the woman, or women, or operative, or whoever she was, has ever been produced. No arrest, no trial, no official inquiry, no formal acknowledgement that the pattern was real enough to merit serious investigation. She knocked on doors. She asked to see children alone. She left when challenged. She was reported in newspapers across the country and discussed in anxious community bulletins and quietly referenced in internal social services memos that no longer exist. And then she disappeared into the same silence that covers everything in this case. The silence of unanswered questions, of administrative oversight, of a generation that grew up and moved on and tried not to think too hard about what the knock at the door might have meant. Some cases give us answers. Some cases give us trials and verdicts and the grim satisfaction of closure. This is not one of those cases. The phantom social worker belongs to a different category entirely. The category of things that happened clearly enough to leave a record, but not clearly enough to leave an explanation. She is there in the archives, or rather she is there in the absence the archives have left where she should be. She is there in the memories of parents who still, decades later, remember the cold feeling that moved through them when they asked to see identification, and watch the woman's face shift into the practiced blankness of someone preparing to leave. How many families let her in? How many parents stepped out of the room? How many children sat alone with a woman whose name and purpose no one has ever been able to confirm? We do not know. We may never know. That is the case as it stands. That is the case as it has always stood and as it may stand forever. A knock at the door, a woman with a clipboard, a request that should have been refused, and a silence afterward that no official explanation has ever fully filled. To truly understand the weight of what the phantom social worker represents, you have to spend some time inside the particular atmosphere of 1980s Britain. Not just the headlines and the political drama, but the texture of everyday life, the way ordinary families experienced the world that the welfare state had built around them, and, increasingly, felt the chill of its less comforting aspects. The decade that began with widespread unemployment and the deep economic restructuring of deindustrialisation was also the decade in which the British state's relationship with the family was being fundamentally renegotiated. Social services departments had been expanded, empowered, and tasked with levels of intervention in family life that would have been unthinkable a generation earlier. The Children Act of 1989, which would become the foundational piece of child welfare legislation for the decades that followed, was itself the product of years of controversy, failed policy, and the public reckoning with cases in which children had died despite being known to welfare services. These were cases that shaped the decade's understanding of what it meant to be a parent, and what it meant to be watched by the state. The deaths of Jasmine Beckford in 1984 and Kimberly Carlisle in 1986, both children killed by abusive caregivers despite repeated contact with social workers, generated enormous public and media pressure on welfare departments to intervene more aggressively, more decisively and earlier. The result, in some areas, was exactly the kind of expanded and assertive social work practice that made the idea of an unannounced doorstep visit entirely believable to any parent who answered the door. Social workers were everywhere during this decade. They were in the schools, they were in the hospitals, they were on the doorsteps of families in every kind of neighbourhood. The professional infrastructure of child protection had become so vast and its reach so normalised that a stranger claiming to represent it was almost impossible to challenge without feeling, however irrationally, that the challenge itself might be used against you. And this is the climate into which the phantom social worker, whoever she was, stepped. She did not create the conditions for her own operation. Those conditions had been created by decades of policy development, by genuine tragedies, by the legitimate and necessary expansion of child welfare infrastructure. She simply, if she existed as an intentional actor rather than a collective projection, understood that the conditions were right, that the uniform of authority was more powerful in that decade than at perhaps any point since, that the question of whether you should let a stranger into your home to speak with your child alone was not, in the Britain of the 1980s, a question with an obvious answer. The terror of being seen to fail your children was, for many families, larger than the terror of someone who might wish them harm. The geography of the reports tells its own story. When Harper mapped the documented incidents, those he could verify through newspaper records and the surviving fragments of official documentation, a pattern emerged that he found significant. The incidents were not random, they were clustered in specific types of neighbourhoods, areas with high concentrations of young families, areas with above-average rates of social services contact, areas where community trust in authority institutions had been disrupted by economic hardship or previous controversies. These were not wealthy neighbourhoods, by and large. They were places where people had less institutional power, where challenging an official figure at the door required more courage and carried greater perceived risk, where the social infrastructure of the welfare state was both more visible and more ambivalent in its relationship with the community it ostensibly served. This geographic clustering is interesting for several reasons. If the phantom social worker was a product of rumour and collective anxiety, you would not necessarily expect the rumours to concentrate in these specific types of locations, rather than spreading more evenly across the social geography of the regions where they were reported. Moral panics tend to travel along social networks, and social networks cross economic and class boundaries more fluidly than a simple rumour cluster map would predict. But if the phantom social worker was a real actor, or a real organisation, the geographic concentration makes a certain cold sense. These were the neighbourhoods where entry was easiest, where refusal was hardest, where the most useful behavioural data, if behavioural data was what was being gathered, could be obtained with the least resistance. There were also, Harper noted with care, several incidents that stood slightly apart from the main pattern. Incidents that suggested, if taken seriously, that the operation had not always gone according to plan. In at least 3 documented cases, the visiting woman had been pursued. Not far. In one case, a parent had followed her to the end of the street before losing sight of her. In another, a neighbour had attempted to take note of a car that may have been associated with the visit, but pursued nonetheless. In none of these cases did the pursuit yield anything useful. No car registration was fully recorded. No clear direction of departure was established. The woman, in each case, simply ceased to be visible. She had apparently anticipated pursuit as part of the operational pattern she needed to manage. This detail, the suggestion of practiced evasion, is one that sits uncomfortably with the urban legend explanation. Rumours do not practice evasion. Misidentified genuine social workers do not vanish down residential streets when followed. The detail implies intentionality, implies preparation, implies an awareness that what was being done required the ability to disappear quickly and without trace, and it implies, above all, that whoever was doing this had done it enough times to know that sometimes people followed, and had developed a reliable response to that contingency. The children, in almost all documented cases, were not harmed in any physically verifiable way. This is important to state clearly. The phantom social worker was not, so far as the evidence records, a case of abduction or assault. The children who were visited remained in their homes, remained with their families, and in the cases where a parent stepped out of the room, returned to their parent within minutes. When the woman left, she left alone. Whatever her purpose, whatever the nature of her interest in these families and their children, she did not take anything tangible. She arrived, she asked, she spoke, she left. What was transacted in those rooms? What information passed from child to stranger? What was observed? What was recorded in whatever method she had available? Is entirely unknown. Some of the adults who came forward in response to Harper's published investigation, the ones who'd been children during the visits, reported that they had been asked about specific, seemingly innocuous subjects. One remembered being asked about her parents' work schedules. Another remembered questions about who picked him up from school and whether he spent time at neighbours' houses. A third, a woman who had been perhaps 7 or 8 at the time and whose memory was accordingly fragmentary, had a clear recollection of being asked whether her parents had ever spoken to her about the government, about politics, about the news. These details, individually, might mean nothing. Children's memories are unreliable, particularly across a gap of decades. The questions, if accurately remembered, could have any number of explanations ranging from the sinister to the entirely prosaic. But taken together, with the geographic clustering, with the behavioural precision, with the missing files and the retired employee's cautious disclosure and the cross-references that led nowhere, they contribute to an evidential texture that Harper described as deeply, persistently unsatisfying to anyone who wanted either the comfort of a definitive explanation or the clean horror of a confirmed conspiracy. The case refuses both. It occupies the space between, the space where the most disturbing things tend to live, not quite confirmed, not quite dismissed, present enough to demand attention, and absent enough to deny resolution. The question of motive, if the visits were real and intentional, is the one that generates the widest range of speculation. For the more straightforward criminal impersonation hypothesis, the motive is presumably predatory access to children, the most horrifying reading, and one that the lack of documented harm makes difficult to sustain without further evidence, but one that investigators of child exploitation cases are professionally obligated never to dismiss simply because evidence of physical harm is absent. The absence of documented harm is not the same as the certainty that no harm occurred. The recording and reporting of harm against children in the 1980s was imperfect at best. For the social research hypothesis, the motive is data collection, information about family structures, parental responses to authority, the vulnerability of households to institutional intrusion. This is disturbing in a different register. Not the horror of individual predation, but the horror of systemic disregard for privacy and consent, of families treated as experimental subjects rather than as people. This kind of motive has precedent in the documented history of Cold War social research programs. The Tuskegee syphilis experiment in America, the various mind control research programs that operated under CIA and MK-Ultra funding, the domestic surveillance programs that Britain's own security services conducted against trade unionists, political activists, and community organisers throughout the same decades. These programs establish, beyond any reasonable doubt, that governments and their intelligence apparatus have been willing, historically, to conduct research and operations involving ordinary citizens without their knowledge or consent. The only question, in applying this precedent to the phantom social worker case, is whether the scale of the apparent operation fits the institutional capacity likely to be involved. And here the skeptics have their strongest argument. The phantom social worker incidents, whatever their true nature, were distributed across a significant geographic area over a significant period of time. An institutional research program capable of sustaining that kind of operation would have required coordination, personnel, cover stories, funding, and management. It would have left traces in budget lines and personnel records and departmental communications. No such traces have been found. The absence of supporting documentation is, in this case, an argument against the institutional hypothesis, rather than simply an artifact of incomplete archives. because institutional programs of this scale do generate paper, and that paper, even when classified, tends to survive somewhere. Unless, of course, it does not. Unless the program was compartmentalized to a degree that placed its documentation entirely outside normal records management systems. Unless the people who ran it understood, from the beginning, that it was the kind of thing that could not be permitted to leave a conventional institutional footprint, this is not an impossible scenario. It is, in fact, the scenario that characterizes several of the most sensitive covert programs that have come to light since the Cold War ended. Programs run off the books, funded through channels that did not appear in standard budget documentation, managed by people who understood that their activities were not merely classified but deniable. The absence of evidence in these cases is precisely what was intended. Harper spent several years after his initial publication attempting to take the investigation further. He submitted Freedom of Information requests to multiple government departments and police forces. The responses he received were, with a few exceptions, polite confirmations that no relevant records could be identified. He interviewed former social services managers, retired police officers, community workers who had been active during the period in question. Most had nothing to add. A few confirmed the general atmosphere of the era without providing anything specific. And then, 2 years after his initial piece was published, he received a letter. The letter was handwritten, posted from a city Harper declined to identify, and signed with a name he declined to reproduce. The writer claimed to have worked, in the early 1980s, for a private research consultancy that contracted with government bodies on social research projects. The writer described, in general terms, a project that had involved doorstep fieldwork in residential neighbourhoods, fieldwork that used cover identities rather than the consultancy's actual institutional identity, on the grounds that undisclosed observation produced more reliable behavioural data than disclosed observation. The writer did not name the government body that had commissioned the research, did not provide any documentation, and explicitly stated that they were writing because they were approaching the end of their life and found the secrecy of the matter increasingly difficult to justify in good conscience. Harper could not verify the letter's authenticity. He never received a follow-up communication. He published a reference to it, with careful qualifications about its unverifiable status, and noted that it was consistent with the research hypothesis without constituting evidence for it. The letter may have been genuine. It may have been the work of someone who had read the original article and wished, for their own reasons, to add a layer of apparent confirmation to an appealing theory. It may have been the product of someone's wish to be part of a story they found compelling. Harper's conclusion was that the letter was interesting, and that interesting was the most he could responsibly say about it. The phantom social worker case has found a second life in the digital age, in the way that all unresolved historical mysteries tend to. Online communities dedicated to unexplained British history and cold cases have accumulated threads hundreds of posts long, in which researchers share newspaper clippings, regional variations in the witness accounts, theories about the Cold War research angle, and occasional contributions from people claiming personal knowledge. The quality of these contributions varies enormously. Some are rigorous and evidentially careful. Others are fanciful extensions of the conspiracy hypothesis into territory that the actual evidence cannot support. The difficulty, as always with cases of this kind, is that the genuine enigma provides a foundation onto which any number of speculative structures can be built, and the more compelling the foundation, the harder it becomes to distinguish the structure that the evidence actually supports from the structures that simply feel right. What is not in dispute among serious researchers is that something happened. The reports are too numerous, too geographically widespread, and too behaviourally consistent to be entirely explained away. Something generated all of those accounts in all of those newspapers and all of those police logs and all of those community newsletters. Whether that something was a single individual, a coordinated group, an institutional program, or a cultural panic that somehow managed to produce perfectly consistent false memories across dozens of unconnected families in multiple regions. Something was there. Something knocked on those doors. Something made those parents afraid in a very specific way, afraid enough to report it, afraid enough to warn their neighbours, afraid enough that decades later the people involved still remember it as one of the strangest and most unsettling experiences of their lives. The children of that era are the grandparents and parents of this one. The neighbourhoods where the visits were concentrated have changed, some of them beyond recognition, gentrified, redeveloped, dispersed. The social services departments that may or may not have issued quiet internal warnings no longer exist in their original forms. They have been restructured, renamed, merged, and reorganised through 30 years of successive government reforms. The police forces that received the original reports and filed them, and in some cases lost them, have undergone similar transformations. The institutional landscape that the phantom social worker operated within, that gave her, or whoever she was, the cover that made her activities possible, is in many ways unrecognisable from what it was. But the question remains. It has always remained, and it shows no sign of resolving itself into an answer simply because time has passed and people have moved on. It is the kind of question that survives its own era, that outlasts the particular social context that generated it, because at its core it is not really about 1980s Britain at all. It is about something more fundamental and more enduring. It is about the moment when a figure of authority stands on your doorstep and makes a request that troubles you, and you have to decide, in the few seconds available before the silence becomes its own answer, whether to comply or to resist, whether the authority is real, whether the request is legitimate, whether the consequences of refusal are worse than the consequences of compliance, whether the thing that feels wrong is an accurate perception of reality or a product of your own fear. The case also raises a question that is rarely asked directly, but that sits underneath all of the investigation and all of the theorising like a foundation stone. What would it take, as a society, to take this kind of report seriously? Not to dismiss it as rumour, not to explain it away with institutional convenience, but to genuinely investigate it with the seriousness it might deserve. The answer, unfortunately, is that it would take exactly the kind of institutional will and independent oversight capacity that the British government of the 1980s was not equipped to provide, and that, some would argue, the British government of any era has rarely been motivated to apply to questions about its own conduct. The complaints came from ordinary families. The reports were filed by local constables. The pattern crossed jurisdictions in ways that no single investigating body felt responsible for assembling. And in the absence of a single galvanising incident, a caught suspect, a confirmed crime, a clear and visible victim, the bureaucratic machinery simply did not engage. It ground forward on its own purposes and left the question unanswered because unanswered questions, in the institutional calculus of large democratic governments, cost less than answered ones. These are not questions that the 1980s invented. They are questions that every generation faces in its own way, with its own particular version of the figure at the door. What the phantom social worker did, whether she was real or imagined, singular or organised, criminal, or institutional, was to make those questions vivid and immediate in a way that most people prefer not to think about. She put a face and a clipboard and a professional smile on the thing that most of us try to believe we would always recognise and always resist. And then she walked away, leaving nothing behind her but the memory of a feeling and a silence where an explanation should have been. That is the phantom social worker, wherever you are listening from tonight, and I genuinely want to know, so please do leave your city and time zone in the comments below. I hope you're somewhere safe, somewhere warm, with the doors locked and the light on. If this story has found a corner of your mind that will not let it go, share it with someone tomorrow, not to frighten them, but because the best thing that can happen to an unresolved case is that more people know about it, more people asking questions, more people checking their own local archives, more people refusing to accept that administrative convenience is the same thing as the truth. If you are a long-time listener who has never left a comment, tonight is the night. Tell us where you are. Tell us what you think happened. Tell us if this story reminded you of something you heard as a child, something your parents mentioned, something a neighbour once said at the garden fence about a strange woman with a clipboard who came around one Tuesday afternoon and left in a hurry when someone asked to see her credentials. The archive is never truly closed. Someone out there knows something. Sleep Theories will be back very soon. Thank you for being here, and for those of you listening on Spotify, a review means everything. It is how new listeners find their way to us in the dark. Until next time, take care of yourselves and sleep well.